And so on the morning of May 2nd, as they had so many times before, protesters kept a vigil. They would not keep any more. A little before 10 o'clock, the witnesses arrived. Among them, reporter Eleanor Garner Hanna, who had been invited by Chessman.
The prison officials took us into a little side room and briefed us about more or less what we could expect. And one of them gave me an ampule of ammonia that I could break if I felt faint.
Chessman entered the gas chamber at approximately 2 minutes after 10.
I sat him down. He was 3 or 4 feet from me. And he looked at me, and I looked at him, and I don't know what I looked like. Pretty distressed, stricken, I guess. And he just shook his head, and he says, "Take it easy." And then he said, "Tell Rosalie I said goodbye."
And the pellets, as you all know, was dropped at 10:03 in the quarter.
We could hear that click when the lethal pellets were dropped, and he heard it, of course, and he simply turned his head away and started taking deep breaths, as much as those straps across his chest would permit. Finally, one of the times his head went down. It didn't come up again, and I saw a tremor run all through him.
And he was pronounced dead at 10:12.
We went outside, and it was one of those gorgeous days on the bay. I just sucked in that air by the lungful, and Chessman had told me that the guards had told him that they'd walk out from there, and, just all they could think about was that they were glad to be alive. Well, it wasn't all I could think about, but it was a good day to be alive if you didn't have to watch somebody being put to death.
The day after Chessman died, America held its 7th annual civil defense drill. The good news in New York was the announcement that this time, when the theoretical nuclear attack was over, there were only 9 million theoretically dead New Yorkers. It was not the big story. The big story was a ghost who came back to haunt America, and pulling the covers over your head wouldn't help. Come back yourself and see.
Our World continues. Cover Stories, May 1960.
Welcome back to Our World and 18 Days in May of 1960. We had learned recently that cigarette smoking was at an all-time high in this country. The pill had just been approved as a safe oral contraceptive to be taken by prescription. We were hastening death and discouraging birth. Free will can be as confusing as trying to figure out the national purpose. Anyway, Elvis was back, Princess Margaret was married, Carol Chessman was dead, and the guy in the Kremlin was getting ready to drop the other shoe.
When Francis Gary Powers was shot down over the Soviet Union, he'd not drawn a natural breath for 5 hours. Artificial intake of oxygen gives a man a headache after a while, and the slightest wrinkle in this suit would pinch for hours. You need strength, you need patience. Powers had both. It would come in handy. Powers would pass the time in a Russian prison weaving these rugs, and they would hold together better than the fabric of lies woven by his government and unraveled by his very existence.
Thursday, May 5th, the Kremlin. Khrushchev opens a meeting of the Supreme Soviet with a long-winded speech. Newspaper reporter Priscilla Johnson.
Khrushchev began to speak, and I noticed that his voice was hoarse. After a little while, I heard shouts low in the hall, and to my right, there was an unmistakably ugly sound, and all I heard was shame, shame. And then I heard, shame to the aggressors.
The Soviets have shot down an American spy plane, Khrushchev says. It's a provocation, he says, coming so close to the summit conference. It's an insult, he says, coming on May Day. He says nothing about Francis Gary Powers. In Washington, the National Security Council is going through a prearranged doomsday test rehearsing the move of government biggies to a secret location in the event of nuclear attack.
While we were there, we learned on the ticker that Khrushchev had announced that this plane had been shot down.
But Washington's cover story has not been shot down. Not yet.
We flew back to Washington at the end of this conference, and by the time we got back, of course, this was public, and Jim Haggerty, the press secretary, wanted to know from Eisenhower what could be said about it. He did not know about the U-2.
At noon, Haggerty still knows nothing, but he tells reporters that the space agency will have a statement. Trouble is, nobody has told NASA. NBC News White House correspondent Ray Shearer.
As soon as Haggerty finished his news conference, it was around noontime, I went over to NASA, which is just around the corner here, walked in the door and said, I've come for the statement. And they said, what statement? I said, the statement that Jim Haggerty said you're going to have. They said, we don't know anything about any statement. And I said, well, the White House said you're going to have a statement. And they were very puzzled, and they put some heads together. Finally, they brought out Walt Bonney, the head of public information for NASA, and he said he didn't know anything about any statement.
State Department spokesman Lincoln White does have a statement. It's the cover story, a bold, forthright, open lie.
The department has been informed by the NASA that, as announced May 3, an unarmed plane, a U-2 weather research plane based at Adana, Turkey, piloted by a civilian, has been missing since May 1. It is entirely possible that having a failure in the oxygen equipment.
By now, Walt Bonney over at the space agency has picked up the cue.
Now, if the pilot continued to suffer lack of oxygen, the path of the airplane from the last reported position...
The statement goes into great detail about that U-2 weather plane. More borscht and baloney.
Saturday, May 7th, Moscow. Khrushchev springs the trap. Standing before the Supreme Soviet, he announces the news. Francis Gary Powers is alive, in Soviet custody, and cooperating.
General Goodpasture called me and he said, this is about as bad as it gets. He says they've got him alive.
The cover story was gone then, of course, and a cover story, of course, many of these things are based on what's called the doctrine of plausible denial, but there was no plausible denial left after Khrushchev said that he had the pilot, and indeed he did have the pilot.
6 p.m., Lincoln White can no longer hold the lies together.
Nevertheless, it appears that in endeavoring to obtain information now concealed behind the Iron Curtain, a flight over Soviet territory was probably undertaken by an unarmed civilian U-2 plane.
Probably. The new truth is not the whole truth, but it's enough to blow the lid off the White House. America has admitted spying and lying. A real cover story, that is.
I have often walked down this street before.
On a street in Moscow, Soviet citizens bought tickets to an American production of My Fair Lady. People talked to Edward Mulhare, who played Professor Henry Higgins.
We opened 2 days after the U-2 was shut down. We had a wonderful time to start with, and everybody was very friendly. And the ordinary people continued to be friendly. But always at an official party, somebody would stand up and say something like, in spite of the fact that your country is sending planes over our country, thereby endangering world peace, we welcome you as artists.